Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I am joined by a panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Standing at attention in Germany, where he runs the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Colonel of Cologne, James Myberg. Getting on a helivac out of the city, we have the Director of Wealth of Audley Capital, the Sergeant of St. James, Simon Lincoln Reeder. And tunneling through the Golan Heights, the Director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the Captain of Connecticut, Richard Tren. Finally, we have waiting for the spare parts to his plane, the founder of France Cranier Private Clients, the editor of the Common Sense, the Field Marshal of the Free State, Franz Cranier. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, the head of internal intelligence at the Common Sense, the defense attaché of Athlone, Gabriel Makin. We have a jam-packed show today, gentlemen, but before we go anywhere, I want to say to the ladies and gentlemen, yes, I have got a haircut. Thank you for noticing. So anyway, today we have the medium-term budget framework, the danger of misidentifying threats, Trump versus the BBC, Trump boycotting the G20, Tucker, Fuentes, and the far right in America, and the DA firing Dion George. So we'll start, though, with you, France, because we have just had the medium-term budget framework announced, and it's actually quite good. So can you take us through that?
Yeah, a couple of minutes ago, the minister finished speaking on what's called the mini budget in South Africa. So that's about 6 months after the formal budget. It's a sort of update on where things are at, and it's really, really good. I'll take you through the highlights. The minister suggested that the rate of economic growth is set to lift from the 1% that the number's been trapped at for a number of years to approach 2% by 2028, and that's perfectly reasonable. It's modest, of course, by global standards, but it is an increase of 100%. And the minister was able to make the argument that the rate of growth can lift because numbers on gross fixed capital formations, that's fixed investment into South Africa, those are projected to turn positive again, which hasn't been the case for a little while. And household spending is expected to lift a little bit as well. And the minister was able to justify those two statements on grounds of port and rail infrastructure reforms, which are slowly and belatedly underway, and also the fact that the energy position in the country has been much stabilized. So that is, relative to what might have been, a good start. Then there's more. Public debt, so that's how much debt the government has. That number has now stabilized. It's stopped after rising year after year for a number of years, and that's very significant. And the minister projects quite credibly that number is going to begin to dip into the medium term, which is the next 3 years, so into, let's say, 2028. The budget deficit, which is the difference between what the government spends and what it earns in revenue, is projected to be cut in half from about 4.5%, so that's negative because it's a deficit, to 2.7% into the medium term. And that's will be very welcome sort of sentiment driver for people who commit to South Africa money or investment or think about doing so. But I think the standout thing, and I don't think many other analysts are going to see it, is the minister said that a process is advanced to introducing what he calls a fiscal anchor. Now, a fiscal anchor will be a policy. It could even be legislated to say that a future state may not exceed a certain limit of borrowing or expenditure or a deficit. Now, I'm pretty certain in telling you that is being done by the GNU partners with a view to who might, in the fullness of time, come to lead the ANC, to make it very difficult for such a person to behave recklessly, blow out the deficit, borrow heavily, drive inflation. It's a very important thing and a very welcome thing as well. Then the minister also announced that South Africa is moving to a new inflation target. Now, the old inflation target was somewhere between 3 and 6%. That's been hardened now down to 3% is the target, with a little bit of leeway to go to 2 to 4% on the sides of that. And that's another very welcome read, because what it speaks to is fiscal prudence, fiscal conservatism, and extremely shrewd stewarding of the country's finances. Now, a point we've long made, and certainly I've made to my clients and the like, and that the Common Sense has made, is that there is a streak of fiscal prudence that runs through the old ANC. This was a party, after all, that had cut the debt levels they inherited from the last apartheid government in half in their first 15 years in government, while recording the first sustained budget surpluses. That was in 2006, 7, 8, since the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. That common sense, let's call it that is still very much at the heart of the government. And the last thing I'll say to you, Gabriel, is if you're a GNU skeptic and you think, what's the point? It's doing nothing. This is an extremely good effort on the part of the finance minister and his two deputies, one from the ANC, from the left of the ANC for that matter, the other one from the Democratic Alliance. And it bodes, there's a long way to go. We're hardly out of the woods. We're a country in a lot of economic trouble. But what we saw this afternoon is an extremely positive indicator about the long-term trajectory, not just of the GNU, but of the country and the economy as well. Gabriel.
So, France, it's very interesting because obviously this is the second budget that we've had this year. And the first budget was subject to a lot more division and a lot less, positive praise, and was a lot less praiseworthy. So, what has happened in your mind in the intervening period that now we come to November after, the kind of attempted VAT increase that happened in March of this year, but the budgets that never were, and all of a sudden we have this kind of renewed sense of fiscal prudence? What's going on here?
I'd say to you, I mean, the sense of fiscal prudence was always largely present in the ANC. It's a thread that ran through the ANC for a time. It's faded and returned, but never been entirely lost. What I'd say to you has happened is this, that for 400 years here in South Africa, because I'm here, some of my colleagues are around the world, is the country was governed in a way that one powerful actor, wherever you were in what are the borders of South Africa today, one powerful actor could decide what happened, and that's how it was going to be. And after our election last year, when the ANC lost its majority, that changed. It's a profound change. And suddenly one actor can't have it their way anymore. And two parties, this time the ANC and the DA, because it's a coalition government between the two of them. The other parties don't matter much. They had to find a way to work with each other. And that was a totally new environment. And so there was a bit of niggle. And the niggle was about the VAT thing, and the DA took a strong stand, which was the right thing to do. And they said to ANC, listen, you won't push us around. You don't screw with us, and we can also be strong. And the ANC realized that, listen, and you can kick them out and join up with MK and the EFF if you want and print money. I mean, that's perfectly an option. They didn't want to do that. So it's the thing starting to settle. And it doesn't mean it's settled now. That must settle a lot further. Remember, the 400 years we ran the place in one way. Now we're trying to do it in another way. And it might take another 5 or 10 years for the GNU partners finally to find each other completely, if they ever do. And along the way, the thing might break up, and there'll be new elections and new party leaders and all sorts of drama. But it is very, very pleasing that in such a short period of time, given the conflict of that first budget, by being strong, both sides, not by being weak and appeasing and indulging, but by the ANC being strong about what's important to it and the DA being strong about what's important to it, on something as critical as the national finances, the two sides have found each other very well, and the demonstrated that to the whole country and the whole world earlier this afternoon. So Well done to them.
I agreed, and I think that that's a good place to leave our wrap up of the budget framework. And we're going to go from a good news story and a story of politicians making the right decision into a completely different one. And I'll lead into this, James. I'm coming to you here because in the Oval Office earlier this year, Trump said it's a genocide that's taking place when he was referring to farmers in South Africa. And now the white genocide, the farmer genocide, is just a dumb idea. There is no white genocide happening in South Africa. And it's a dumb idea because it's not just only wrong, but it is also actively harming the conversation about what is a very important issue in the increased level of violence that farmers in the country are subject to. And this kind of is a point that leads into what you're going to be talking about today, which is the damage that can be done because of threat misassessment. So, James, can you take it away?
Yeah, sure. I suppose just to begin with the farm attack issue, as it's seen from, I would say, America, there's a sort of far, far, far right view that actually would like to see farmers get attacked and suffer a so-called genocide, because that would then, the sort of very fringe groups say, would then radicalize white Americans. So you've got on the very far fringes a sort of that sort of view. Then I think on the right you've got people learn about this problem which has blighted post-apartheid South Africa, which is the violence against farmers, which reached its sort of highest intensity in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it's generally shocking what was happening. And I think Trump must have clearly heard about it at some point, and it stuck with him, and so he actually feels strongly about it. And then on the other side, you've got the sort of race-conscious left in America, and they see white farmers as the sort of embodiment of the colonial oppressor or whatever, and they find it morally objectionable that farmers today are seen as still white farmers still own the land that they do, although their figures are all wrong. But still, they feel passionately that that's a historic injustice that needs to be redressed, and they share in a way a similar view to the ANC, the EFF, and MK. So that's the sort of context. Now, I think in America there's a tendency to always try and reach for the genocide comparison. So you read about this horrific sort of form of crime in post-apartheid South Africa, and then you reach for the comparison to genocide. It's not applicable. In fact, it's very rarely. It's such a rare crime that one shouldn't actually use it at all. And it applies, and it usually happens in certain circumstances. One is a war situation. So it's just the wrong, if you're going to calibrate what you're describing, it's totally the wrong measure. So then what happens is people use this inappropriate measure. They say, look, there's 100-foot giant, walking through the land. And the person who's walking through the land is an 8-foot person, and maybe he's the tallest person who's ever walked, but he's not 100-foot. And then, of course, what happens is the other side, which is the sort of more the left-wing side, sort of seizes on the white genocide idea, and it reports on this obsessively, because obviously it's not true, and it's a total exaggeration. But by reporting on the exaggeration, you then diminish the reality, and you pretend that there's been no problem at all. And so you avoid speaking about an actual problem. And what currently has happened is the numbers, whether it's correlation or causation, the numbers of farm attacks, and the victims now are very multiracial of those attacks. have come right down under the sort of harsh glare that Elon Musk and Trump have put on the problem. So then when Trump uses very, very sort of inaccurate language saying the slaughter is sort of ongoing, it sort of discredits the whole issue, and it allows people to then, go off again from the left, talking about white genocide and how it's a total fiction. And as long as that conversation occurs, you don't actually have to talk about the real problem. And for just ordinary people who are sort of watching this tennis match of this ball getting hit back and forth, it then creates this, you have this crying wolf problem, that people stop believing anything, and they start thinking that this is a real fiction, that this is just a fiction and nothing ever happened. It's totally made up or whatever. So I think that's more or less to sum up the issue. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more one can say, but I think we're under very restricted time.
All of that's very interesting, James, but I want to ask you about something. I believe that this is not the first time such a tactic has been employed, using the exaggerations of your opponent to discredit the overall argument, because, the kind of extreme of your enemy has taken it too far. And I believe that this might have been a tactic employed by the Nazis in the lead up to the Second World War. Is that true? Am I right there?
Well, I mean, and this is the most infamous example there is, and I'm sort of hesitant about raising this anyway. But essentially, is that obviously the Nazi Party were infamous anti-Semites, and they had various chants and songs which ideated the destruction of their enemies and of the Jewish people in particular. So when just as they were coming to power in March 1933, there was a lot of very overblown reporting in the world press, predicting that there was going to be the word didn't exist at the time, but predicting an imminent massacre of Jews and communists in Germany, and this got huge coverage in the press at the time. It started out, I think, in a London newspaper called the Daily Herald, and then it spread across the Western media. But that prediction didn't come to pass. I mean, there was a lot of maltreatment of Jewish civil servants and judges were getting physically thrown out of their offices and positions. There was especially communists were terrorized and beaten up by the brown shirts. But this sort of utter sort of this mass slaughter of the Jews it didn't come to pass at the time. And at the end of the month, Goebbels then drives this propaganda campaign against the Jews, saying you've run this vicious propaganda against us. And in fact, they even passed a law saying you're not allowed to peddle atrocity propaganda against the good German people. And this was then used to justify the early anti-Semitic legislation in Germany. And then what notoriously happens is when in the early 40s the Holocaust actually does get set in motion. The international media is very hesitant about reporting it, and it's never front page news. It's always buried in the back pages. So this kind of reckless language is you have to be very carefully calibrated what you say. It has to be accurate, and it has to be to the right. You have to make the right comparison. It's reckless to make the genocide comparison when it's not happening, and it opens the door to sort of bad actors to come and use start saying, well, you can't believe anything about what's being said about what's happening in this country. So yeah, so that is the sort of absolutely infamous example of how this can be abused.
Does anyone else want to contribute anything here?
We should in the future talk about the data itself and what it shows. And we're looking very carefully at that now. And we'll produce, I'm certain we will produce estimates of exactly what the position is with regards to farm attacks and farm killings and what the trends have been. And I think we've seen enough to give you an overhead. Farmers are far more likely to be attacked than the average for the general population. If you compare armed home invasion robberies, for example, we're pretty certain on the data for that now. We're also pretty certain on the data that an attack on a farmer is more likely to end in a homicide, in a murder, than in a similar violent attack across the broader population. So farmers are more likely to be attacked. Data says that. They are more likely to, those attacks are more likely to end in homicides. We're certain on that. We're certain on another thing as well, that black commercial farmers, of which there are a growing number, are as likely to be attacked as their white counterparts. So in as far as it has been suggested in some of the American communication that this is a problem that afflicts whites, we think that is completely false in the main. Next thing we'd say is that South Africa's murder rate overall is at the moment about 44 or 45 per 100,000. So that means that 44, 45 people in the country are murdered every year for every 100,000 people that are present in the country. And you may ask yourself, is that a lot or a little? Well, I'll tell you, Australia's number is about 1. The number in the United States is usually about 5 or 6 or 7. So the entire quantum of South African society is orders of magnitude more likely to be violently attacked and murdered relative to the averages for the rest of the world. And it's an issue, therefore. We can have an argument about who's more likely to be attacked, and that is important. Some people might be more than others. But to turn that into a kind of victimhood Olympics, when across the whole of the society there's this daily slaughter being carried out, is not the right way to do it. Because it's that collective fear and understanding of violent crime that actually unites South Africa. It's a one experience. If you're black, white, rich or poor, that you probably have in exactly the same way, is the sense that you might be violently attacked in your home and murdered. And it's the kind of thing that should therefore be applied from a political perspective to actually bring the society together, to point to the outrageous nature of it, the complete failure of the state to safeguard its citizens. And it's what makes James's contribution here today so very important, that if you misstate the nature of the threat, you allow people who wish to say there is nothing wrong at all to do that and to get away with that. More so for the fact that it is the collective experience of all South Africans that they suffer terribly from serious and violent crime. And yeah, you get what I'm saying to you. So there you go, Gabriel.
Yeah. First to you, Simon, then to Richard.
Yeah, just to tell James that the worst part of Enoch Godonwana's address was when he thanked those 44 useful idiots at the very beginning. The rest of the midterm budget speech was great, but he went out on a limb and thanked those people for stumping up essentially for the state, which was disappointing.
Richard?
Yeah, just to agree completely with what James is saying, and say, just in random conversations that I have here with people after that Trump's discussion of white genocide, that it really has had an impact here, and people retreating into their ideological camps, those who are in favor of Trump going on about genocide, those who oppose Trump dismissing it completely, and both sides turning this into a racial thing that's not helpful. So just, being on the ground here, we're seeing this play out, and you're entirely right in your assessment of this. And
Let me just say to Simon about the ministers. He opened his budget address this afternoon, not with the budget, but with the Afrikaner issue and Mr. Trump's comments. Now that tells you something about how deeply this sort of goes to the heart of the thinking of the government. And he did cite those 44 people who, you know, were taken in to some extent by the state. But the entire situation has arisen because of the misstatement of this issue to begin with. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in that position. And I mean, I tried to argue a bit on this. He is the state, and the South African state has falsely been accused in by omission or directly of presiding over a genocide of a portion of its population. It's exactly what James has said. That if you do that, then you do firstly place the state in a position where it needs to defend itself, which the minister did, and he'll use whatever mechanisms available to him. And they manufactured this letter, and he uses that mechanism. This situation would not have arisen, and he would not be in the position, firstly, to be prompted to do that, motivated to do it. Had this been handled responsibly by the Americans in the first place. So to a degree, I understand what the minister was. He's a politician, and he defended his government against false accusations.
So I think that's a good place to move on from that topic. But we're going to stay on the half of the subject on Donald Trump. And we're going to a different war that Donald Trump has been engaged in. And Simon, you're going to be telling us about Donald Trump versus the BBC. And now the BBC has been caught this week actively spreading disinformation about Trump. And so can you just take us through what has gone on here?
Yeah, this is a nice add-on from France's statement, because Donald Trump has been the subject of false allegations. And I think let's go back 2 weeks where a dossier arrives on the investigations desk at the Telegraph newspaper in London. And the Telegraph is a centre-right newspaper. It's a very good newspaper. They've got very good writers, one of whom is the associate editor, Gordon Rayner, who picks up this dossier. And it contains memos from an individual by the name of Michael Prescott, who was retained by the British Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC, as their independent standards reviewer. And in his memos, we see evidence of editorial failures by the BBC on 3 specific subjects: Donald Trump, Israel-Hamas war, and the transgender debate. And with Trump, it relates to a speech that the BBC spliced different parts of and then made it seem as it was one coherent address. And this involved his speech to people who'd gathered in Washington on January the 6th, 2021, who subsequently went on to protest. The Israel-Hamas issue is particularly egregious. It shows that the BBC has consistently platformed anti-Semites, consistently misrepresented the views of Israel, and has failed to correct those misrepresentations, even when warned by staff to do so, one of which was a claim it made that the courts in The Hague, the international criminal courts, had declared that, on South Africa's urging, that Gaza was the scene of plausible genocide. It was not, as the BBC represented it, and it took a long time for them to correct that. The third issue, the transgender debate, Michael Prescott presented evidence that shows the BBC's own reporters were censoring the views of gender-critical feminists. So you've got reporters censoring. And what happened last week is quite interesting. From So I said this was a fortnight ago, and the case started building against the BBC under pressure from the Telegraph. And through the course of last week, what the Telegraph did was they dedicated a section of their website to this investigation. They've done that previously in the parliamentary expenses scandal of 2009, and this wasn't going anywhere. And by Friday morning, all of the scrambling by the BBC's reputation managers and PR people had come to nothing, because that's when, on Friday last week, the briefing got to the White House and Donald Trump. Can I explain what's happened next with Donald Trump, Gabriel?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. So Friday evening in the White House, Donald Trump is reportedly briefed by his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, and he's got another one of his aides is a fixer dude called Stephen Chung, who's very familiar with the media. And at 10 o'clock on Friday night, we were sent notifications from the Telegraph, and the notification simply read, "Trump declares war on the BBC." That prompted an urgent meeting between BBC executives on Saturday that was led by the chairman, Samir Shah, and it was decided at that meeting that an apology be composed, addressed to the head of the Parliamentary Select Committee on Culture, a woman called Caroline Dinenage. Now, as Saturday progressed into the early hours of Sunday, it became clear that that was insufficient, and that in actual fact, only pounds of flesh would do. And what happened at midday on Sunday was that the CEO for BBC News, Deborah Turnus, under who these issues exist and were allowed to flourish, these editorial failures, she resigned. 5 p.m., the big boss, Tim Davie, resigned. That led up to Sunday night, and then Monday came along, and we got whacked with the news that Donald Trump had sent the BBC a letter. I've seen the letter, and it is it's Trump, put it that way. And what happened in that letter is that he has made a series of demands for apologies and a request for compensation. Now, Donald Trump expects the BBC to run 24 hours of apology. So basically, all of the news, all of the reality television programs, they change the content of EastEnders. So it's just apologies to Trump. Okay. So whatever that is. And he said that if you don't do that, if you don't apologize in a way that I feel appropriate, then I'm going to sue you for 1 billion. All right. And then, okay, so wait. This is the best part of it. So then when that figure is announced of he's taking them to court for a billion, all of the left-wing journalists scramble, the left-wing lawyers and journalists scramble, and they go, "Oh, no, this is just vintage litigious Trump, and he's got a very difficult claim without any merit because it's impossible to see exactly who was influenced by this speech that was spliced and faked." So that's the point that was raised, and so we're paying attention. Then what happens is one of the BBC's own veteran reporters, a guy called John Simpson, and he's one of these guys who goes around telling everyone that Nelson Mandela was his best friend. Nelson Mandela had a lot of best friends in London, especially in the media and politics. But he writes a tweet and he goes, "Oh no, I hate Donald Trump. I love the BBC. There's nothing wrong with the BBC. And I'm very proud that 77 million people have been reached in America by BBC News." He said that on his tweet. And then 5 minutes later, he's like, "Oh, delete." Because Trump's lawyers at that time going, "Thank you, John. Thank you for telling us that you've reached half the voting public in the US. You've made this the scene of the crime. The court in Florida is going to love this." And so, who knows? But I'm not. The apology is due for Friday, 12 a.m. UK time, which is 5 p.m. in Washington. Who knows where this is going to go? There has been a number of politicians who stood up to protect the BBC. Why, I have no idea, but the reputation has taken a massive knock this week. Tim Davies out, Deborah Turnus is out, but it still does not answer why it does that. Why does it behave like this? And then you can examine exactly how influential it is, because you could probably see this sort of behavior aped in every major newsroom in every country, English-speaking country, Australia, South Africa, and the US and Canada. Gabriel, back to you.
I'd like to make the point that it does not happen in every newsroom. There is one newsroom in particular in South Africa that has never published there's never been a piece of bias that has even dared to enter through the door. But before I have a question for you, Simon, but before we get to that, Richard, to you.
Yeah, so I mean, what we need to understand about the BBC is that it is funded by these license fees, and every year, every British citizen or every British homeowner has to pay, what is it, like 170, 180 pounds that it is forced to pay, and if it doesn't, it gets £1,000 fine. I think you can get some criminal record for not paying. So my question, I mean, if you want to know why it goes that way, it's because it has guaranteed income and it doesn't have to it doesn't have to be truthful. It can continue lying. We spoke, a few weeks ago about its reporting on Israel, that it has an agenda. It doesn't care about the truth, it seems. And it can do that because it has this guaranteed income. But my question is, do you think there's now an appetite? I think early on in the Johnson government, there was an appetite to reform this. Could this happen now? Do you think we could get rid of the license fee and make them actually pay for themselves?
Yeah, look, it's a question. I mean, it needs to happen because it even left-wing politicians will tell you that it's no value for money in a poor country. But like that, how it does that is something that I'll discuss probably. We can move on to that. Yeah. I mean, I think, Gabriel, if I could just add on to Richard here, I wrote a piece for France for Common Sense this week, in which I said this is a profound moment for Western journalism, and perhaps I should have elaborated more. I didn't mean that people are going to suddenly start having personality transplants, and these journalists are going to turn into decent people with senses of reason and logic. I didn't mean that. I meant that the consequences of what has happened here will be felt in America, where the BBC is trying to break in. It now shares a content with CBS News. Do you know who the head of CBS News is? It's Barry Weiss now. Okay, is she a fan of this Israel reporting? Now, these are serious things that we need to consider. The BBC is charging Americans $8.99 to access the news behind a firewall. Okay, there are very serious things that could happen. And so to Richard, this is maybe one way of asking. It says that it's got a shortfall in its operating costs of £500 million. That's because it's lost 4 million license payers in the last 4 years. And that's because people are turning off. They don't want to hear this stuff from specialist LGBT reporters. I mean, what does that even mean? That is not a job, okay? That's a non-job. That's like a non-worse job. But anyways, so the point is to go. It might be the subject of political reform. It also may be the subject of its own collapse. And Brendan Carr, who's your FCC guy there, FCC is a political institution. He is watching this, I imagine, very closely, and so are all the participants. And the BBC has got competitors like Warner Brothers and Paramount and Disney and Netflix in the US. So even before this happens, the question of it breaking into the market is very suspect. Back to you, Gabriel.
Richard?
Actually, I just want to say that I was commenting on all this. I was listening to a discussion, I think it was John Sopel and some other woman from the BBC. And their entire take on this, Emily Maitlis, yeah, and their entire take was this was just their competitors, these capitalist newspaper owners trying to destroy the BBC. And not once mentioned was that this was an internal discussion. This was an internal BBC report on how biased they are. But they try to spin this as though this is just these greedy capitalists trying to put the noble BBC out of business. It's foul.
Gabriel, can I just finish on a point here to complement Richard's remark there? Is that nobody, we've got, I think standing in the background here, is that you've got to actually examine what's happened to this organization, particularly in the last 2 decades. And you kind of start and end with one name, and that's Jimmy Savile, who was the entertainer who died in 2011. And he was the corporation's biggest star, but he was also the world's biggest pedophile. Okay, I don't know what was going on in the Hindu Kush, but I can't imagine they were so prolific as to molest 27 minors in one night and steal a glass eye from a cadaver lying in the morgue of the hospital, which Jimmy Savile did. And you can go, you can say, oh, well, this is one terrible person who tarnished the reputation of a corporation. And you could do that. But the problem is, it wasn't just Jimmy Savile. They've had dozens of allegations. There's a white journalist, DJ in his 60s, who's just a BBC DJ, who's just been charged with raping young black girls. There was Hugh Edwards, who announced the death of the Queen in 2022. And last year, he was convicted of possessing and making the worst grade of CP. You know what I mean when I say that, okay? But he wasn't filming. He was at home playing on his computer, presumably the same home he shares with his wife and children. And this has never been answered. So for Emily Maitlis to go, oh well, this is just a brutal competitor ploy by these right-wing capitalist people. No. That organization has got serious demons that haven't been exercised, and a lot of people feel rich that just that alone warrants its collapse, warrants its implosion, shutting down, whatever you want to call it. Gabriel, back to you.
Well, as one giant media organization collapses, another rises in its place. Viva the common sense. So we're going we're gonna go to a different topic. We're gonna do a little bit of a personal journey before we get on to your one of your topics of today, Richard. Because you've spent some time away from us. The ladies and gentlemen were crying out, missing you last week. But you were doing very important work on the Syrian border, I believe, between the Syrian and Israeli border. Let me get this up. Are you seeing my? There you go.
I'm in the bottom left. Yes, sorry for my absence last week, but I spent 9 days in Israel. 5 of those days were spent with an organization called Sarel. It's not Sarel, but Sarel, SAR-EL. And it's an organization that pairs civilian volunteers up with the Israel Defense Forces, and you get sent to bases all around the country, and you do whatever they want. You help in whatever way you can. And I was very lucky to be sent. There I am. Look at me. Look how manly. I was sent with 15 other guys to the Golan Heights, to the Hermon, which is a base right at the top of the Golan Heights, which is kind of the highest point in Israel, and right on the border with Syria and Lebanon, a base that was captured after the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So it was with these 15 other guys from all over the world, Czech Republic, Canada, the United States, Spain, France, Italy. And, we were working with these soldiers. We were very lucky to be with the Golani Brigade, quite an elite brigade, and the Givati Brigade as well. And we helped them do grunt work. We were picking up trash. We were helping them reorganize their bases. I cleaned the kitchens, and we helped reorganize kitchens. We were sent to a kind of forward operating base out in the right on the border with Lebanon, where we helped to reorganize that base, including carrying hundreds of incredibly heavy jerry cans filled with water and moved them around so that they could reorganize the base a bit better. We were up with a lot of, this is a very heavily Druze area, and we were with quite a lot of Druze soldiers who, very interesting people and wonderful people. And we also visited Majd al-Shams, which is the town up right in the north, the Druze town, where those 12 children were murdered by Hezbollah when they fired a rocket into a soccer field, killing children playing soccer. So, you know, it was a wonderful and very, very meaningful time to be there. At the one base where we were right on the border with Lebanon, where we were moving around all those jerry cans, we stopped in the middle of the day, and the soldiers were in their base watching the TV, and there was a funeral going on. Asaf Hamami was a colonel in the IDF who was killed on October 7th, and Hamas stole his body and kept it for 2 years, and then they finally released it. And they were watching the funeral of this man, Asaf Hamami. Well, it turns out that he was their commander. And, you know, these were Givati Brigade soldiers, reservists, but kind of from a pretty elite force. And, you know, these soldiers have seen and experienced things that we can only imagine. These are tough guys. And to be there with them, with the tears in their eyes as they watched their commander's funeral, was quite a moving thing. It was a sort of special moment. So it was a terrific 5 days. It was hard work, but I felt it was a very meaningful work. And, you know, on a previous episode, I just described the soldiers of the IDF as magnificent, and I can only double down on that, having spent some time with them, living in their base with them. These were truly dedicated and magnificent soldiers. So that's what I was doing. If you want to know why I was up there, well, without wanting to sound overly dramatic, it does feel like we're in a historic battle for civilization against some very dark forces that seek not only to destroy Israel and murder every Jew on earth, but to destroy Western civilization itself and to destroy our way of life. And that battle is happening all over the world. It's happening in London, in Paris, and in Rome, and in Washington, and in New York, as we've seen with the election of Mamdani. But Israel is on the front lines, and Israel is doing more, and the Israeli people are doing more than anyone else to defend Western civilization. And so I feel like we have to, Israel is like this essential country right now. We have to defend it as an outpost of Western civilization in a very hostile part of the world. If Israel falls, we'll all be a lot worse off. So I do that because I care about the survival of Israel, of that outpost of the West. But I also went for very selfish reasons. I went because I like my life. I consider myself incredibly fortunate to be born in the West, to live in the West, and to be born at this time. I am very lucky that I get to live the life that I do, that I can live where I want and say what I want and write what I want, love whom I want. These are things worth preserving and worth defending. And you don't defend them by sitting on the sofa picking fluff out of your navel, but by getting up and going and doing something. So that's why, I was motivated. If I can sound a little pompous, it was Winston Churchill who wrote that everything of value in the West owes its origins to Athens and Jerusalem. So to reason and revelation. And we must defend these things, because to be complacent or to give up is to give up on everything that we hold dear for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren. We right now in London, Jews are being detained by the police for looking visibly Jewish. If that doesn't send a chill down your spine, I'm not sure what will. This is, as they say, it always starts with the Jews. It never ends with the Jews. They're coming for you next. The Islamists and their useful idiot enablers in the West are trying to tear down everything that we hold dear. And it's worth defending, and we must defend it. So, Gabriel, join me next time. Let's go and support the IDF. And even if you don't buy into this little peroration that I've given, you should go to Israel because the weather's terrific. The food is outstanding. I mean, I've had, whether it's the sort of corner store selling falafel or chicken schnitzel or high-end dining, the food is out of this world. And if that doesn't motivate you, then you can sit at the beach in Tel Aviv and watch some of the best-looking, fittest people on earth running up and down, playing beach volleyball. And it's okay. It's okay to enjoy the eye candy. I'm only human. And that's another reason. If you're not motivated by anything else, then go for the eye candy. There, I've said my bit.
I think it's the magnificence of the soldiers, as you talk about, that's motivating me at the moment, Richard. But Simon, over to you.
They let you keep that uniform.
No, sadly, I had to give it back, but I could keep my little epaulets.
Do you want to wear them next week, just for our boomers?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that was a great. Thank you so much for the story, and I'm sure the ladies and gentlemen were very happy to see you looking the scariest out of all of the soldiers that were displayed,
Yes.
Richard. I think if there was any question as to why, if Israel was going to succeed when you landed in the Golan Heights, the question was answered. But now it's interesting that we start on a story of Israel and the Jews, because your news story for this week is about a couple of people who really don't like the Jews, but they're not from the Islamo left side. They're from the far right. So can you take us through this emerging schism on the right that seems to have been, a lot of it's been prompted by this Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson podcast?
Yeah, I really didn't even know about Nick Fuentes. I consider myself quite fortunate. He's a 27-year-old little twerp who's a violent bigot, racist, Jew hater, a nasty, nasty piece of work who says that women actually like to be raped. He's vile in every way. He's a great fan of Hitler, and it turns out a great fan of Stalin too. And so he's way out there. But Tucker Carlson is an interesting character because he was kind of a mainstream conservative, had started out, I think, on MSNBC, then was on CNN, then ended up at Fox. It's supposed to be somewhat of a libertarian. At one point was a fellow of the Cato Institute, the sort of the premier libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C. This was years ago. We have some friends in common who we've sort of all fallen out of touch and out of favor with him. But he's been on this little journey. He was fired from Fox, and ever since has trended more and more to the extreme. And I'm not quite sure. This is an ongoing conversation with friends. Like, what happened to Tucker? Has he actually lost his mind? Because he talks about being attacked by demons in his sleep. He goes on about all sorts of weird, bizarre theories. He's embracing a sort of extremist isolationist policy, and is going on quite an anti-Semitic tear, blaming the Jews for pretty much everything. We don't know whether he's lost his mind or whether he's being funded by Qatar, whether his new paymasters are behind all this. It's curious, but he's a skilled interviewer. He's a very smart man. He's a very skilled interviewer and will aggressively cross-examine anybody. He famously had Senator Ted Cruz, who's a Republican senator from Texas, on and grilled him incredibly aggressively on his stance, his support for Israel, and his support for Trump's action in attacking Iran recently. But when he has this little twerp, Nick Fuentes, on, he basically just fluffed him. He was just sort of stroking his ego and didn't question him at all. Look, it's up to him to do that. He can do what he like. What's more worrying in this, and this kind of exposes this rift that's going on the right, and I think this is actually a very healthy thing that the right is going through now in examining what it stands for. What is worrying is that the Heritage Foundation, which is the sort of premier conservative think tank in DC, it has an annual budget exceeding $100 million. It's been around since the 70s. It's been the most influential conservative think tank with Republicans in office and in the Congress. It was recently in the news, well, before the election, for the Project 2025. This marketing is the blueprint for the Trump agenda. And this is put out as this something new, but in fact it's not. The Heritage Foundation has been putting out a sort of blueprint for a conservative administration since the 80s. This is what it does. But it always had a guide star of limited government, of conservative values and it was above politics in that way. It influenced politics, but it wasn't political in that way. And it has morphed, and it had a few years ago took on a new president, a man called Kevin Roberts, who came out after this Tucker Carlson Fuentes debacle and strongly, almost embraced Tucker, calling him a close friend and that they'll always stand with him, and against his cancellation. And to be clear, no one was trying to cancel Tucker. People were criticizing Tucker. Canceling him, that's completely different. That's not a cancellation. No one's saying Tucker shouldn't be broadcasting, but we can and we should draw some very firm lines here and call out this kind of vile, putrid ideas that Tucker is spewing. And it's not just, let's get off the topic of anti-Semitism. It's not just that. He has been stroking the Putin. He did this ridiculous story going around Moscow, talking about how wonderful Moscow supermarkets are and how cheap it is. Of course, ignoring the fact that he was going there paying with dollars, and that ordinary Russians trying to survive on rubles do fare far less well. So this is kind of bad and stupid journalism. So what we're seeing, and this is, I think, a healthy debate. We're seeing from the people that Tucker is part of this camp, and there is a far right wing who reject the founding principles of this country, who reject the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and embrace a kind of post-democratic, post-capitalist world in which, I mean, their argument is that what has the Constitution given us? This has all led to a world in which we can't tell the difference between men and women, and we have a huge debt, and we're sort of morally adrift, and they want to reject it all in favor of what? A much more forceful, anti-democratic, anti-capitalist kind of government directed out of Washington, D.C. So this is, I strongly believe in the classical liberal foundations of this country, and I think we should be defending it. This is an ongoing debate, and it's healthy, and we should embrace it. And I hope that the side that I'm on wins. I will say, to end up, and I don't want to go on too long, that while the right is having this debate, the left is not. And it's very interesting to see how frightened they are of addressing these controversies, of absolute pusillanimity when it comes to talking about whether girls should be in boys should be in girls' sports, or whether men should be allowed into women's locker rooms, or whether it's okay actually to win the mayorship of the biggest city in the country on an extremely Jew-hating agenda. The left is not having that argument, and I think the right is, and it'll hopefully come out stronger.
So,
thank you,
Simon, to you first, and then to James.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with Richard. This moment of self-hygiene is very important, and it's not what you are seeing, as you pointed out, in the left. And you could see that, I think that there's also the question, Rich, that this perspective holds itself to higher standards, because even in the lead up to last year's US election, nobody was going to Hassan Piker or to Mehdi Hassan and saying, look at how you're damaging the Democrat brand, and they absolutely were. And so I think this is good. I'd prefer nobody gets cancelled, and I agree with you that Tucker wasn't, but you have to be held accountable for where you're going, because you don't want to get to a point where you start alienating people from the cause, and you start, like some UK journalists have made themselves completely inaccessible by following these wild pursuits that aren't actually, and polling shows, in the zeitgeist, in the where people want to be thinking. So I think that this is invariably healthy.
James?
You make two additional comments. One is that Nick Fuentes it behaves, whether he is or not, like a classic agent provocateur. Someone who says such outrageous things that you can only and disgusting things that you can only think, and he says disgusting things about J.D. Vance and so on, that you can only think that he's working for the enemies of conservatism. Even if he's not, if you behave like that, then you should create a cordon sanitaire around that kind of person. And the second thing I'd make about, when Tucker Carlson did that interview in the way that he did, the response was absolutely predictable, and you can criticize, and it caused reputational harm and embarrassment to people who had stood by Tucker Carlson. One of them was the Heritage Foundation. So it was a stunt, whatever the motive was, that actually embarrassed Tucker Carlson's own friends and allies, who might not agree with the direction he's gone, but have stood by him as his friends. So it was a sort of disloyal behavior, I think, from Tucker Carlson as well, in that the broader sort of conservative debate.
Yeah, I mean, you just described Fuentes as an enemy of conservatives. Absolutely, he's not a conservative. He's a vile. I don't know what he is, but he's a troll, and there's nothing about him that belongs anywhere on the conservative spectrum. He's hideous. Of course, he is an enemy. I do want to recommend to our listeners, not that I want to take them away from this fabulous podcast, but if you want to hear exactly who this Nick Fuentes is, and try and scratch your head wondering why on earth Tucker would want to interview him, Ben Shapiro, the podcaster and journalist and lawyer, whatever, produced, I think it's about a 40-minute podcast where he did the hard work of actually listening to Nick Fuentes and pulled quotes. And it's worth listening to, just to see quite how vile he is. He has no place anywhere in polite society or any society. It's worth listening to.
Yeah, I think that, we touched on this issue earlier in the podcast about 9 weeks ago, when we were talking about this kind of rise of the woke right. But this Nick Fuentes character, I don't even think woke right, does it justice. To borrow a great phrase from France's wife, communo-fascist is probably the most accurate descriptor.
Yeah, can I
But
just make
anyway,
one quick comment that it seems like there have been attempts to cancel people, and it's restrictions on free speech, and you saw this a lot during COVID, and it seems like people after that want to sort of think that it's because our enemies try to restrict our speech, we should then be able to say whatever we like. And no, we can still police our side. Just because you weren't allowed to talk openly about whether or not you wanted to take a vaccine or the origins of COVID doesn't mean that suddenly we get to say the most vile things. We can still have standards, and I do see that the right trying to maintain some standards there, and as Simon said, people like Hassan Piker on the left, that's not happening there. And from the Heritage Foundation, there have been some very significant resignations, and this is welcome. Let people leave these organizations that are failing until they reform.
Yeah, well, I mean, the point of freedom of speech is to, argue against the bad ideas. Sure, you're entitled to say what you want, but you aren't entitled to not have the consequences for saying what you want. But now we're going to move on we're going to stay on this kind of broader Trumpy universe. And we're going to move to France because Trump is boycotting the G20, and you're not sure this is the right decision. So, can you take us through your first disagreement with big old Donald?
Well, I think there's a better strategy than what has led to this boycott. If they were to ask me, I might say to the Americans that I think you've got an enormous opportunity in South Africa under Trump. And the opportunity is to find common cause on values with South Africa's center-right Christian conservative majority, because that's what the country is. I mean, if they ask for advice, how can they win in SA? This is what I'd tell them to do. And they haven't done this. They seem to have come to South Africa with a preconception that South Africa is split in the same way that the West is split between increasingly hardline left and a hardline right. And there's a deep gulf. And they are the hardline right, and so they'll fight everyone else and try and destroy them. But that analytical framework doesn't apply to South Africa because we're not that kind of country. We haven't followed the West into these deep divisions. In fact, we've made the argument, and I continue to, that South Africa is not a multicultural society. It doesn't have a deep cultural cleavage. If culture is the collective values of people, then in South Africa, we're essentially a unicultural society where comfortably 7 to 8 out of every 10 people agree on the basic values that inform their outlook on the world. And that makes us very different to Western society. So to come in with the sense perhaps that, South Africa is 70% hard left, African nationalist, and 20% of the DA, which you might think is Keir Starmer, and then there's 10% left, and they're the hard right wing, and those are our allies, so we'll back them. I think that's getting your analysis of the country wrong completely. And in fact, the values that the Americans purport, or the administration purport to admire in the Afrikaners, the sort of idea of the hard working Christian conservative family types, those values are universally shared across society, including by the great majority of Black South Africans. So that's the worst of it. Almost is of the American strategy that it's really repeating an old left-wing trope of Southern Africa. That Southern Africa is a region that is split between the Black nationalist majority and the white settler minority. And the way you do politics or foreign policy in Southern Africa is you pick which one of those two sides you wish to ally with. And all that's different in the Trump crowd is they've decided to pick the small minority. But it's the same analytical mistake, because that's actually not the nature of the South African society at all. And that if that was the point of departure for, and therefore the basic understanding of South African society on the part of Washington, and it was sincere in its wish to build positive relations with South Africa, this would be, for me, the basis of the strategy. And then from there, from there you can begin to solve the problem. And there are lots of ways that, should you wish to, you could take issue with South Africa and justify, if you were to wish to boycott a meeting, you could do that. And the best example of this, actually, the recent example, comes not from the Trump administration, but from the Biden administration. When Ruben Brigitte, he was Biden's a final ambassador in Pretoria. When Brigitte came out that afternoon and said that the South Africans had loaded weapons onto a Russian sanctioned ship, and this was unacceptable, he created. I can tell you what happened in the background of that, because I'm quite familiar with the incident. Is the South Africans scurried that afternoon to try and sort things out with the Americans. It was a very effective strategy. Now, the very same points the Americans raise about the Afrikaners: crime, violence, farm attacks, property rights, the misapplication of South Africa's empowerment policies. These are all these are all issues that Black South Africans suffer under as well. I mean, we've made the point earlier on this show that on the farm attack data, to our read of it, we're confident now in the numbers that farmers are more likely to be attacked than the balance of the population, and attacked, and that the violence of those attacks is excessive relative to the average of the population. But Black South African farmers are suffer from exactly the same thing. On the question of property rights, James and I have previously estimated that in the eastern half of the country, which is the fertile half, the west is a desert. In the eastern half, more than half of land by productive agricultural value is in Black possession, but not ownership. We have to say possession, because it remains the policy of the South African government 30 years after democracy that a lot of Black land is held in trust, either through the state or through traditional leaders. So if you're worried about the risk of expropriation in South Africa, which you should be, because there's a very dangerous law on the books now to do that, you might start worrying about the fact that tens of millions of people remain in a position where they don't have property rights, before you even get to the threat of taking those away from the few that still have them. And on the question of empowerment policy broadly, the manner in which that policy has been misappropriated as a fig leaf for looting and corruption has probably done more damage to Black South Africans, given their socioeconomic status, than to whites who face those problems from the position of well-established multi-generational middle-class families and quite strong international ties. So you could even use the very issues that the Americans are focused in on the South Africans to make the broad case across society about the resonance on cultural values and the like. When I don't know if I ever told anyone, a politician, this, I probably told one or two people, but when the Trumps first came out and said the Afrikaners should be refugees, what I thought to myself, and I'm hardly an Afrikaner leader at all. I'm not that, and when I've sometimes been identified as that, I've actually asked not to be, because that's not what I am. But I thought that if I were an Afrikaner leader for a moment, as Richard was thinking about what Churchill would have done earlier today, I might have said the best thing for the Afrikaners would be to say, we really, really do appreciate the fact that you are aware of and interested in the problems we have in the country and how we suffer, but we are not prepared to get in that refugee queue if Black South Africans that suffer equally are not able to join us. And I think that if Afrikaners want to have a long and successful future in Southern Africa, which I think they might easily do, they would best achieve that by looking at that kind of thinking, that kind of approach, rather than throwing in their lot with people who I'm increasingly starting to suspect, some of them, and therefore a useful segue from where Richard has taken us earlier, are playing up this issue in South Africa to play to a hard right American base and constituency. And it would be, I mean, as foolish as the 44 that signed that silly letter denying that there was anything wrong at all, falling for this right-wing American stuff be as counterproductive to the future of Afrikaners. There you go, Gabriel. That's what I think about the boycott of the G20.
Great. Well, thank you, Franz. And because we're moving pretty quickly to time here, I'm going to not ask you a follow-up on Trump's boycott, but I am going to force you to do a double feature because we had a piece of news, South African news, unrelated to Donald Trump, and that is that John Steenhuisen has asked for President Ramaphosa to replace the Minister of Forestries, Fisheries and the Environment, Dion George, who we are not a fan of at the Common Sense, with Willie Okamp. And we think that this is an eminently sensible position to take, don't we, Franz?
Yes, we do, Gabriel. We think that John has done a good thing here. He was the environment minister, he's from the DA, and John has told Cyril Ramaphosa to axe him from the cabinet and replace him with someone else. Now, this is very good in several ways. One is far too many cabinet ministers get recycled long before their due dates. And in what John has done, to say on accountability, if you can't perform, if you're actually acting at odds with the best interests of the country and the economy, I'll replace you, is a very good example to the broader cabinet and all the varied parties that are there. So that's good. But this chap, Dion George was his name. Yes, Gabriel, Dion George. He was a zealot in his environmental ministry. And last week, James did a great thing for us because James spoke about payoffs. And how in Western culture, people have pursued, let's say, one moral good at the expense of absolutely everything else, doing a lot of damage. And that the willingness to make hard choices in Western societies is something that hasn't been exercised quite as acutely as it should. Now, amongst other things, he banned or moved to ban fishing with drones. Now, what happens there is there's a small sort of class of fishermen who use a drone to fly their bait out deep into the water to catch a fish. And this was banned because it wasn't a nice thing, or wasn't a thing that the DA minister thought people should be allowed to do. Now fishing from a boat catches far more fish, even recreationally, than fishing with a drone. So what was next? He then moved to ban the lion trade. Now that's the breeding lions for their bones and things, and also for rich Russians to come and hunt them. Now I don't like the idea of the lion trade or of hunting a tame lion. You might as well hunt a merino sheep. They grew up right next to each other in parts of the Free State, I could assure you. But and it's cheaper to hunt the sheep, and you can eat it, and it's nicer. They're both about equally vicious by the time they've been brought up. But the point is that lion and animal welfare is very important, and animals should have a good standard of living. But where that condition is met, there are people who invest in this as a business. It earns income, it pays tax, it attracts tourists. There are people whose employment is this. You must be very, very careful about banning an entire industry because you do not like it. I do not. There are many things I do not like, or that many of us might not like. But if we each got to ban the things we did not like, the consequences could be severe. And most recently, he's been delaying the issuing of permits to hunt rhinos and leopards and the like in South Africa. Now, under CITES, I'm told by a hunter who knows all these things that I called this week to check up that South Africa has a plague of leopards. The way the chap put it to me is they're being wiped out or something by just commercial farmers because they're eating the sheep or the cows or the cattle or the calves or whatever they're eating. And South Africa can, under CITES, apparently issue up to 150 permits a year to hunt a leopard. Now, this chap also tells me if a wealthy foreigner comes here to shoot that leopard, the contribution to the country's rural economy is about R1 million. That's what goes into it. And he'd been delaying issuing these permits. And South Africa's, if you haven't been here, you should certainly come. It's an absolute pinnacle of conservation in Africa, we're overrun with wildlife of all sorts, and even things that were almost extinct are well protected. We have far too many elephants and rhinos running around all over the place, although there's a serious poaching problem. And the reason South African conservation works so well is that the animals have a value. The commercial utilization of game creates a value, which means there's an incentive to protect them. And that is how the whole conservation industry here works. And commercial hunting is a very important part of that, and domestic and the foreigners that come and hunt. And I read this afternoon in preparation of this a study from Northwest University, which showed that literally billions of rands a year are generated by both the domestic and international hunting industries. And yet here you had a cabinet minister who was attacking an environment minister, attacking the very basis upon which conservation in South Africa is a success from both a conservation perspective and an economic perspective. So John did exactly the right thing to say no more. This isn't the way we do things. We're a government that's trying to create a new and thriving economy for people, and I wish for you to be replaced as the minister. It's a lesson that hopefully will be taken to heart in across the cabinet, Gabriel.
Yeah, Franz. I think we're going to go to Richard quickly. He had a hand raised.
Well, I put my hand down, but there is this is encouraging. I just want to say that, you know, the research and the study of free market environmentalism has been around for a long time, and the benefits of markets to protecting wildlife and the environment is well studied, and we should be embracing markets. So just to reinforce what you're saying, I will say this kind of ties in. Last week you were talking about Bill Gates's change in on his climate change agenda, which I think is kind of interesting, and I guess this in a way kind of ties into this more of an embrace of markets and you know, rational thought when it comes to protecting the environment. And I think I just want to add on to one little comment on what you discussed last week, a little anecdote on how important it is that Bill Gates changed his mind on this. A long time ago, I knew people who worked at the Gates Foundation that now moved on, but I remember having a fascinating discussion with someone who worked there. And this was, I don't know, 2005 or 6, and there was some G7 or G8, I can't remember whether Russia was in or out at the time. There was going to be a big meeting to discuss the Millennium Development Goals and development generally, and Gates was going to go there. Gates, being the richest man in the world, could have picked up the phone and been briefed on what the Gates Foundation request should be of these major donors. And he could talk to the Pope if he wanted to. Who did he choose to talk to be briefed and to get their strategy right for this G8 meeting? Bob Geldof. What does that say? To me, that says that he's much more interested in how people think of him. He didn't want to talk to development experts or economists or people who might understand how poor countries become rich. But he wanted to talk to someone who could kind of stroke his ego and talk, you know, because he's interested in being popular. And the fact that he's changed his mind on climate and hopefully on other environmental topics too, maybe means that he's more open to reason and evidence than being popular. That was my little addition to your comment, your discussion.
Over to you, James.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Frans. I know the intention has been announced, and Steenhuisen has asked Ramaphosa, but is there any reason why Ramaphosa will or will not agree to this cabinet reshuffle?
I don't know. Ramaphosa knows the commercial kind of farming and game and conservation world well. It would be very peculiar if he didn't. But I don't know anything about that.
Okay, fair enough. Well,
doesn't Ramaphosa famously own his own game farm?
Yeah, he has farming interests, and so he knows that world and how it works. And buffalo too. He trades in those sometimes. I've read in the
Yeah,
press.
and couch cushions. No. What? How does he? How does he? But I am going to insist that I get this last point in before I wrap it. And it's in response to what we were talking about earlier, Richard, on Nick Fuentes and Tucker. I should have made it at the end of your speech. I'd put it on the wrong page. But there was a great post by the Babylon Bee, which I think kind of sums up where Tucker is now. And the post read, latest Tucker guest, Bigfoot, reveals how mind-controlling chemtrails are sprayed over the flat Earth by the Jews.
Yes. Yep.
So thank you very much to ladies and gentlemen for watching today's episode. And thank you so much to the panel for your contributions today. And ladies and gentlemen, please join us again next week for another episode of South Africa's Best News Podcast. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this has been Makin Sense.